I'm very pleased to have Dr. Chris Seiple here with us today. He has a long bio, but just to give you two-line bio, he is the president of IGE, Institute for Global Engagement. He is a Stanford graduate and also graduate of the Naval Postgraduate School and the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. He is the founder of the Review of Faith and International Affairs and a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and among other things. So I was told not to talk about politics, religion, and sex during dinner, but Chris engages with politics and religion on a day-to-day job. So I would love to hear how it plays out in the global arena in this modern day and age. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Chris Seiple.
Thank you. Good morning. I don't talk about sex, but I will talk about religion and politics with you today. And as you may or may not be able to tell, I am from out of town. I'm not native to the Google campus, but it is good to be back in California. We were at Stanford earlier today. I have a colleague, Mike Gerson, with me in the back there, and I appreciate your time this morning. To be clear, the Institute for Global Engagement is not an international dating service. That brief is someplace else, nor are we an international spousal mail order business, but we are a think and do tank that builds religious freedom worldwide through local partnership. A think and do tank that builds religious freedom worldwide through local partnership. As I understand the essence of Google, and I'm looking forward to be educated more, in many ways we are about exactly the same thing. That is to say that we are about creating an environment where people have access to free information to make better decisions. And in our case, make sure that they have the freedom to live out those decisions, and if they choose to revisit those decisions through more information or analysis later in life, that they can change again. Bottom line is a level playing field where the customer decides. That's the essence of freedom of conscience. That's the essence of religious freedom. We are motivated by a Christian faith, but we are pluralistic in our means and ends. And what does that mean? It means that we take the command to love our neighbor seriously, so seriously that we struggle with what does it mean to love a neighbor in a practical fashion who doesn't look or vote like me? It's pretty easy to love somebody who looks or votes like you, or hang out with them. We all do it. It's human condition. But how do you reach outside of your cocoon? That's the Christian side of the house. But we are fiercely 3NP is how we say it. Nonprofit, nonpartisan, non-proselytizing. Nonprofit, nonpartisan, non-proselytizing. We want to engage the world as it is. We want to create a level playing field where people have freedom of conscience to choose or not choose faith freely. We think that's the foundation of civil society and how we engage with each other. We think that's ultimately the best counterterrorism tool that exists. It's a form of preemptive peace if people understand and respect the minority. That's ultimately what freedom of conscience is societies where people protect and promote the minority, ethnic, racial, otherwise, in their midst. Those types of societies don't go to war with each other. Those societies don't allow for the extremism that can validate violence. So what I'd like to do today briefly is tell you a little bit about the Institute and what it looks like in action. What does a think and do tank do? And then provide some background on our philosophy of engagement that has been revealed over the last 8.5 years of our existence. We're coming up on our 9th birthday on September 1st, and then get into Pakistan. Because Pakistan is the world's most dangerous, most difficult place, and if we can't figure out a way to be relevant there, we're toast, to use an academic phrase. Okay.
You may want to give them a chance to ask you questions, either if you want at the end or in the middle.
Sure.
Why you guys are here.
I am open to. I am. If you're not buying what Seiple's saying, hey Seiple, I'm not buying it. Just interrupt me. I'm happy to do that. You can't offend me. I mean, freedom of conscience is freedom of conscience, right? Interrupt at any time if there's something that's not clear or you don't like, and I'll give my best explanation or understanding, or we can have Q&A at the end. Also, I should mention that we've got some handouts over here that explain who we are and what we do, with recent trips to Syria in April, and then Vietnam and Laos last November. So we're a think and do tank that builds religious freedom worldwide through local partnerships. We believe you got to think before you do. Americans too often are ready, aim, fire, ready, or fire, aim, ready. We want to think before we go into action. Think before you do. We have conversations. We have an annual global leadership forum. This is with a member of our board of advisors, Natalie Albright. This conversation is about how do people as individuals steward their identity as a global citizen, as a citizen of the United States, and as a person of faith. How do those things influence one another? What takes priority? Fascinating conversation. The guy on the left is actually my father and the founder of the Institute 9 years ago, along with my mother. I should also say Natalie is going to be a part of our 10th anniversary in 18 to 19 September next year in Washington. You can come to Washington, wear a jacket, be a part of the cool crowd, and participate in the 10th anniversary that third weekend in September. We're also talking to other secretaries of state to get them involved and talk about what does relational diplomacy and citizen diplomacy look like in the 21st century. We publish a journal on the Think side. This is the Review of Faith and International Affairs. It's available at RFIA, Review of Faith and International Affairs, rfiaonline.org. It's the best journal in the world because it's the only journal in the world. There are no other journals that look at the role of faith in international affairs. There's a multi-faith board of advisors and board of contributing editors, and their whole purpose is if you agree, disagree, are a humanist, whatever the case might be, tell us what you think about the role of faith and religion in society, in realpolitik, those kinds of things. This is the winter issue where we took on Islam and pluralism, and we had a roundtable discussion about common word, where Islamic and Christian theologians have talked about what it means to love God and love your neighbor. We publish policy-type things, stuff that's only read in the Beltway, but important stuff. What is the future of religious freedom? What should the Obama administration be doing? On the do side, which is why we exist, we do this thing called relational diplomacy. Relational diplomacy has three characteristics, but it's founded on one basic foundation. That is, you seek to understand and listen first, and then continue to do that as you engage. Now, this might seem simple and obvious, but it is not simple and obvious for American engagement worldwide. We work in East Asia, as I mentioned earlier, and I had a former senior communist official say to me, who had served 3 tours in America, UN and Washington, said, "You're the first human rights group to ever talk to me and not give me a list and not tell me what to do." And I said to him, that doesn't excuse how your government has treated minorities, nor does our treatment of you, and let me apologize for our treatment of you personally. Because you are an individual, you have inherent dignity, and we have to be able to talk to each other. That's how you begin to build respect and a concept of mutual hospitality, if you will, between people, between countries. There are 3 characteristics to relational diplomacy. One is top-down and bottom-up. Government, state is top-down. You work bottom-up with society and with the grassroots level. Lots of NGOs do bottom-up. This is the century of bottom-up. But you still need, especially in Asia, top-down approval, or at least a wink and a nod to do the things that you have to do in some of these cultures and states. Secondly, bringing private and public spheres together at the top-down and the bottom-up levels. And then third, kind of living roadmaps, roadmap agreements where you come together in partnership with local folks. You develop a plan in partnership with them. You don't come with a cookie-cutter approach. You need it, here I come. These are your needs. This is your assessment. Here's how we can come alongside you to make you look good, to make us look good, and to be a friend of religious freedom as well, in a manner that's consistent or sensitive to the culture and consistent with the rule of law. And what's important about these agreements is that often in places in Asia, the culture is a shame-based culture. And what we'd love to do in the West and feel good about ourselves is name, blame, and shame. Is to point the finger, write an op-ed, feel good about ourselves, and that changes nothing on the ground and actually makes those responsible for persecution or repression, they dig in deeper. Now, there's a time to write an op-ed, don't get me wrong. There's a time to yell it from the mountaintops. But 90% of the time, my experience has been it's better to build the relationship and show how what you're doing is not some Western form of cultural imperialism, but it's consistent with the culture. Every culture has a mechanism for respect. Every culture has a mechanism for hospitality. And then anchor it in that tradition. So this is relational diplomacy. We've got a board of advisors. We like to say that we operate in the radical middle, somewhere between the leftover left and the self-righteous right. Nonpartisan, nonprofit, proselytizing. Everybody from Netherlands to top Department of State officials, former directors of the Agency for International Development. Brady was President Clinton's AID guy for 4 years. Andrew was President Bush's guy for 5 years. And then also leading academics. John Esposito, probably one of the top experts on Islam in the world at Georgetown, a dear friend. We just did a conference with him at Georgetown on evangelicals and Muslims, having an honest conversation about reconciliation. That was fun. And then Mark Gopin, leading expert in conflict resolution and transformation, also an ordained rabbi at George Mason University. Religious freedom, folks, is a big tent issue. It is an issue that we can all get behind. I don't care whether you are a secular humanist, an American patriot, or someone who takes your Abrahamic faith tradition or other faith traditions seriously. Respect for freedom of conscience is something that we can all find a way to work together on and to do so in a practical fashion. Okay, question of the day. How do interest and values balance out for common purpose? Now, I'll let you decide who represents hardcore, hard power interest and who represents soft power values between the dog and the cat. There's dog people, there's cat people, but the common purpose is clear. The common purpose is clear. How do we balance those things out? How do we do hard power and soft power together such that we apply smart power, that we promote values in a way that preserve interest, promote values in a way that guarantees stability in very difficult and complex places? This is a difficult thing to do as Americans. This is from the West Bank side of the wall in Israel-Palestine.
Into the microphone that somebody has.
Okay, Christine.
Can someone dialing into the VC mute themselves? We can hear you.
Thank you. There's this great line from Bannu from the Joshua tree where he talks about the flame of liberty and being burned by it, being burned by her. And by the way, this has nothing to do with Democrats or Republicans. We are the big elephant in the room. We are the 800-pound gorilla. When we use words like religious freedom, democracy, human rights, that is often received as disguise for American empire, disguise for we can do it because we can. Might is right. The weak do it because they must. You have to be aware of that. I don't care what your politics are. This is the world as it is. And many people in the Muslim majority world tend to see this mix of values and interest of hard and soft power in a negative way. Now, our philosophy of engagement. There's 3 approaches that you can take, in my experience and understanding of doing this for 9 years, about how to engage the other. This is Mr. Magoo on the floor of the Uzbek parliament in Tashkent. And too often our engagement strategy, whether it's Democrat or Republican, is you need to look like us. It's mirror image engagement. If we have more NGOs, we'll have pluralism. Because we all know NGOs equals democracy. I wrote a dissertation on Uzbekistan, and this was AID's fundamental driving force. We could not compute how to deal with religion and clans in that cultural context, which was their pre-existing civil society, and all of us came in and said, you don't have civil society because we know that civil society equals NGOs and equals XYZ in democracy. Just ask us. We're good at it. You need to look like us now as opposed to realizing that it takes time from 1776 forward. Mirror image engagement, I don't recommend. The second one is the monolith. Okay, we're not going to mirror image, but we really know who all those Muslims are, right? Especially in this culture, especially in the Christian context. We love to stereotype. It's very hard to conceive of the Muslim as our neighbor. If he's got a turban and a long beard, he's the boogeyman. That's a budget thing to fund my intelligence program or my military program. That's a little glib and a little overstated, but not much. I'm the guy on the right, by the way. Islam is differentiated as much as Protestantism and Catholicism. You have to understand Islam in its local culture and its local context, and you have to engage them in a conversation. The first thing out of this guy's mouth, this is up in the Northwest Frontier Province, is, hey, the Jews and CIA did 9/11. Okay, let's move past that for now and talk about other things and see if there's a way to partner. In this case, it really didn't seem to emerge, but it did with others. The last thing, you've got, again, mirror image, monolith, and then what I call the micro. Are you going to understand how that person's worldview is shaped, literally? What is the geography, social and human and physical, that has shaped how they engage the world? Anytime we go into somebody else's house, we are a small person. We think of ourselves as bigger because we have the money, we're used to it, and face it, if you've traveled anywhere in the world, you dig the fact that you've got an American passport in your pocket. That's the get out of jail free card, right? I don't have to live here. Sucks to be them. I'm going to do my part, but I want to be home, and then I want to do something for that child on my refrigerator and sponsor him at $30 or $40 a month. You got to know what the local nuances are and understand the intellectual and historical forces that have shaped them, and to realize that you are just but one small part in it from a very distant part of the planet. And if you begin to understand that local context, you have a much better chance of listening and understanding, and most of all, communicating respect. Okay, segueing into Pakistan. There are three ironies to the 9/11 attack, and if you can make it out, the World Trade Center towers are back over there on the right-hand side. I took this picture July 4th, 2000. This is the stern of the John F. Kennedy, an aircraft carrier, the symbol of American might in the world. The three ironies are this. We're only going to dwell on the third one, but I want to mention the first two anyway. The first one is that we were warned. This was the second time the trade towers had been attacked. The first time was in February '93. We continued to treat it like a trade or like a legal issue, a law enforcement issue. Wrong approach. That's a part of it, but not the whole approach. Second thing is that the John F. Kennedy had been in the harbor on 9/11, it could not have prevented the attack. We think of our national security has been militarized throughout the Cold War. We think of national security as the military and something that takes place over there. National security is about much, much more than that. It's not just hard power, but soft power. Interest and values as two sides of the same coin. The third irony, especially for those of us among the elites, and that's who we are, if you're working at Google and you go to some of the schools in this area or on the East Coast, you're part of an elite class, whether you like to think of it or not. With 9/11, religion was back. And that's not something we've been taught to think about. I've suffered through 36 graduate courses to get a union card called a Ph.D. in International Relations. 2 of them mention religion. 2 of them, and only as a catalyst to conflict. Because God is dead, secularization is taking place, and in my cocoon, there's no place for that. We don't talk about religion and politics in polite company, assuming you keep polite company. The bummer of it all is our global society, our global security, and our national security as a lesser included set exists at their intersection. So you got to get comfortable talking about religion and politics. And if you're feeling a little squirmy, you should. But for much of the world, 80% of the world or so takes faith seriously, and in the Muslim majority world, at least 90% of them take faith very seriously. And you have to be able to relate to them. Religion, isn't that part of the problem? That's the way we've all been taught to think about this. This is Maulana Bannu. He is the head of the largest madrasa in Peshawar, which is the capital of Northwest Frontier Province. This is October of '05. And two things I will always remember from this conversation. One is I went there to talk about Islam and learn and listen about his perspective and how he saw the world. Then we got to talking about politics, and I said, well, what do you think local political leaders think about this? And he literally said, well, I'm also the head of the majority political party. They don't separate politics and religion in many places in the conservative Muslim world. That's when the light bulb went on and said, okay, time to be even more humble and listen more clearly and intently, because this is not what I just didn't know how to think about it. The second thing that he said to me is back to interests and values I continue to think about. And he said this: you Americans, you want respect. We want tenderness. This guy has prepared, there's 800 students there at any one time. Students are called talibs. It's the Taliban comes from the madrasas. This madrasa is the largest one in Peshawar. It sent young boys into the Taliban, old and new, 90s and now. It's a fascinating statement. And what he meant by it was this, because I asked him 2 years later when I visited, because I thought about it, and he had said it just as I was leaving. And he basically said this: you guys need respect or want respect because you're a great power. You do what great powers do. I don't care what your self-perceptions are. Great powers interfere in the internal affairs of other states and societies. That's the world as it is. Just be nice about it. Just engage us and show some respect for our culture, as opposed to coming here, doing what you need to do, and then not taking care of the people. This is in the context of all the Afghan refugees that came into Pakistan after the Afghan war. And if any of you have seen Charlie Wilson's War, that last scene after they've raised $500 million to arm the Mujahideen, they couldn't get $1 million for the school. That's what he's saying. Obviously, it's also much more complex than just go get the bad guys. There are issues of justice, issues of governance that have to be taken into account. It's not an excuse, but it's certainly a factor that contributes to the rise of extremism. The Taliban along the Durand line, the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, they anchor their legitimacy in justice. They provide local dispute mechanisms on land and on criminals and people who are being un-Islamic, viewing pornography and things like that. And it's so bad because the government in Islamabad has underfunded this area for so long that they want any decision at this time as opposed to no decision. So they listen to the Taliban. And by the way, there's nobody to fight against, or nobody has a credibility or legitimacy to say we can do governance better. Counterinsurgency at the end of the day is a competition for governance. Who has the better idea about how governance, how security and services are delivered to a local people? Now, the strange thing is you spend a bunch of time in this part of the world and in other Muslim countries, you begin to realize that the best of faith is the best way to defeat the worst of religion. The best of faith is the best way to defeat the worst of religion. This is a madrasa. This is a madrasa in Bannu, on the border of northern Waziristan, just down the street from where John Walker Lynn from Marin County was trained. It says in the hadith of the sayings of the Prophet, he who helps the orphan gains the keys to paradise. As a Christian, I'm down with that. These are orphans. They're learning skill sets. Now, of course, the same madrasa can also teach extremist ideology. But there's a reason the madrasas are popular. They provide meaning and identity and practical vocational skills, not to mention education in the total absence of an educational system run by the government. What would you do? You'd want to raise, if you're from a conservative religious family, I don't care what the faith is, you want to raise God-fearing kids that don't get to watch Madonna on the satellite TV. Same is true for conservative evangelicals as it is for conservative Pashtun Muslims in the frontier. Now, this is the guy that was on the campus flyer that you saw. His name is Akram Khan Durrani. He's standing in front of our house, and in particular the sunroom that he used to pray to Mecca, which caught us by surprise when he visited us, and we were happy to honor him with that and give him that prayer time, and his 3 sons. I was approached in fall of 03 by a guy from Reading, Pennsylvania, who was a Pakistani American. He had just been to Northwest Frontier Province, and he came up to me and said this: I don't know what you do. I think you build bridges. How would you like to meet a guy who just got freely elected in a rule of law system on an anti-American, pro-Sharia platform? And my response, of course, was not only no, but hell no. We're not. That's not what we do. That's dangerous. We can't be involved in that. And then over time, it kept coming back. It kept coming back. And finally, we invited him, and I brought him to America as my guest. It was the first time that he had traveled outside the Muslim-majority world. It was also in the wake of him being quoted in local papers about saying that the Jews and CIA did, a common myth over there, did 9/11. So here we are talking to a no-kidding Islamist who says he wants to implement Sharia law, but is in a freely elected parliamentary system. He was the chief minister of the Northwest Frontier Province from 02 to 08, and now he is the head of the opposition there, still participating in the rule of law system. When we brought him over, I had the neocons writing, "Let's arrest these bloodthirsty bigots, don't let them leave our country." And then I had the New York Times writing that we were a right-wing Christian organization because we thought God was sovereign over all things, and therefore, according to them, we didn't believe in church-state separation. That's the radical middle, between the leftover left and the self-righteous right. So I figured we were doing something right. As an aside, try funding this. Try going to a donor and saying, "Hey, I'm going to talk to this Islamist guy who wants to use anti-American and pro-Sharia." We couldn't find anybody from any community until a guy by the name of George Russell, Stanford grad at 54, says, "I don't believe what you believe in terms of faith, but I believe in that value." And he funded religious freedom, freedom of conscience, and engagement, and he funded this whole thing literally the week before, and then I called him up on Friday the 13th, July 2005. I said, "This is going to cost $30,000 more," and he said, "I'll do it." So it's a strange thing how all these things came together. It makes the case for God if you didn't believe in one, because there's no way that you can write this kind of script. And so when I met him for the first time, we put him up at the Fairmont Hotel in 24th and M Street in Washington, D.C. He's the 6th-ranking political figure in all of Pakistan. No American official would talk to him at this time because he was an Islamist, even though he was freely elected. And I had no idea what to say to him except, "Why do you do what you do?" And I was almost embarrassed because I thought, that's all you got? That's all you can say? And his response was this: "I believe that on the last day I'm going to stand before my Creator and be held accountable for how I govern my people." I said, "You know what? We have differences, theological and political, and they are deep and many of them irreconcilable, but I believe that too. Let's find a way to work together." So I took him around the U.S. for 10 days. I made a point to take him to Ground Zero in New York City. He's not been quoted since saying that the Jews and CIA did 9/11. And then, of course, we began to get to know his culture and how he thought about things, which is very different than how we thought about it. This is from a briefing at the Khyber Pass, which is between Afghanistan and Pakistan, and they're talking about the Pashtun tribes. If I didn't tell you that, and you didn't see the title, you could think I was talking about any rural part of the United States, especially my Texan friends. Freedom-loving, tough and hardy, proud and courageous, excellent fighters, respectful women and elders. And then this last one is the most key: highly hospitable, ready to protect their guests at any cost. The reason we wouldn't be harmed when we went to Pakistan is the same reason we can't find bin Laden. When you come under their honor code, it's a different game. You're no longer an American, you're one of them. You're a guest. And this is where you anchor a concept and a conversation about freedom of conscience, about respecting the other. It's going to be very different words and very different people at that table, but the same principles. So we signed an agreement to holistically promote religious freedom in his province. Now, what's fascinating about Pukhtunkhwali and how serious they take it, this is October 9th, 2005. This is the day after the earthquake killed 139,000 people in that province and the one adjoining it. He's in the middle of coordinating the entire crisis response, and he makes time to sign this thing and say that we believe in this, we want to find a way to implement it. What does that look like? Well, we did a conference on religion and respect, held it in the Pearl Continental, which was recently bombed about a month ago. This is May of 2007. And to our great surprise, we thought we were just doing Muslims and Christians, and what he did was he went further and invited the other minorities in his province, which are very small. Sikh, Hindu, Ismaili, Shia, all at the same table, literally, for the first time in the history of Northwest Frontier Province. How many of you heard about that on Fox News? Or CNN, for that matter? And then we held the conference, and the audience that we invited were the 40 top imams and the leading student leaders from the 3 universities in the region. And you know what the metric for success was? The Hindu and the Ismaili, the Christian and the Shia took twice their podium time. They had never been given the opportunity to explain to their fellow Pakistanis that they were proud Pakistanis and wanted to contribute to society as well. These are not my interpretations. This is what they told me after. So that's a top-down. But bottom-up, what does it look like? We took a delegation down to Bannu on the border of northern Waziristan. And in that delegation, we had a Peshawar-born elder. Well, he's a doctor from Cleveland, Ohio. He speaks Pashto. And I'm speaking there, I spoke third this day at the University of Bannu. But he spoke first. He spoke in Pashtun. And he told the story about how in 9/11, his neighborhood in Cleveland locked arms around his whole mosque so that it would be protected. In a place where they think every American is a Christian, is an evangelical, has a sword in one hand, has a Bible in another, that makes a big difference. Hearing it from somebody speaking in their own language, a gray-haired man who is held up and esteemed in that culture. But also, on the far left, we had Sarah Karim speak. Recent graduate of Wellesley, speaks Urdu, and she's from Karachi. Covered, showing respect, but also saying, we as Muslim Americans are a part of this delegation that also includes Christian Americans, and we literally embody this idea of not just tolerance, but respect. And then you get a chance to hang out with some heroes. Now, this is not what you're expecting, and you can have all kinds of stories about whether they should be liberated or not, covered, whatever. I really don't care. This is how they honor God and how they honor their society and honor the gifts that God has given them. They speak better English than I do, and they want masters in IT and MBAs so they can stay in the region. They're the future. That's success in the war against the terrorists, right there. And so we're funding 2 cohorts of students, paying 60% of their tuition, books, and fees. And the stipulations are men and women are together. You have tribal area and NWFP. You include minorities. And then as part of the curriculum, you have a dialogue that meets once or twice a week, and you talk about Islam and global society, which is another way of saying, what is the Pashto Islamic understanding of showing respect for neighbor, for demonstrating respect for the minority in their midst? And we have these conversations. The school has just recently opened. It's been in the middle of a war zone, and they just started back on 3 August. But they're doing this, and we're the only NGO, to my knowledge, Western American NGO, doing this kind of work in that part of the world, which is ground zero in the Taliban. Now, in conclusion, you probably lost sleep last night thinking about why there were no witch trials in Rhode Island. Raise your hands. I see them. Why is America, well, let's put it this way. I think the greatest gift we have to give to the world, and I think every culture and every society has gifts to give, is this principle of freedom of conscience. It's important that we don't export the American form of it. It's important and imperative that we come alongside this principle in other cultural contexts in the way that it existed there before we arrived. But religious freedom and security, values and interests have been a part of our founding. And the reason we are a success as a society, I'm convinced, is the difference between Massachusetts and Rhode Island. I lived in Massachusetts. I'm a part of the Red Sox nation. Follow them religiously. But Massachusetts was a theocracy. A theocracy. And Roger Williams fled there. He fled west in the winter of 1635, 1636, established Rhode Island, and came up with the Rhode Island Colonial Charter of 1663. That's not my spelling, but that's the original English. And the purpose is this, the point is this: if you let people practice their faith freely, they are less likely to agitate against the state violently. And so Rhode Island quickly becomes the home to Quakers, Jews, Indians, Baptists, and people of no faith at all. And what's fascinating about Roger Williams, I'm just 1 second from finishing up, I'll come right to you. Is it because he lived in Plymouth when he first came to Massachusetts? He actually had pre-existing relationships with the Indians. And so when he fled west, he didn't flee into this vacuum where he knew nobody. He knew them, and then he did something radical. He paid for the land. Can you imagine something crazy like that? We didn't learn that lesson the whole next 2 centuries. And then showed respect because of freedom of conscience, as he believed was consistent with the Christian faith. And that has made all the difference. How do we do this? It takes time. We have to take a long-term, multi-generational approach and understand that it's not going to look like us at the end of the day. Condi Rice, when she was testifying before Capitol Hill on a number of occasions that I saw on TV, she was always getting hit with, well, why doesn't democracy take place faster? Why doesn't it take place overnight? And she just noted the irony to the congressmen and women who were asking the questions. You know, that Constitution said that I was 3/5 of a person when it first started out. And it took a good 200 years. And from the Emancipation in 1863 to the Civil Rights Act in 64, 65, this stuff takes time. It's delicate, it's intricate, but our job is to keep pushing the ball forward. With that, I'll stop and take this first question. Thank you.
So the charter actually has, there was, the notion of religious freedom is a little challenging. Okay, I'll see it's twisted around this way. So the notion of religious freedom is a little challenging. Notice, there's the bit that's not highlighted, which basically says, religious freedom, grounded, of course, on gospel principles. And I've encountered this when I was living in France, and went to an ecumenical service. It was, all religions are welcome. We all believe in Jesus. I said, well, I'm a Jew. And this, oh, hang on. So, I think there are a lot of societies that believe in religious freedom, but their definition of what religious freedom is, of which flavor of Christianity or which flavor of Islam or which flavor of Judaism do you want? Right. And so that's, I think it's crucial, and it looks like you've been very successful in getting others to question that. But I think when people talk about religious freedom, there's this presupposed context that you need to get beyond.
Absolutely. And in fact, the U.S. gets hit hard on, we established the International Religious Freedom Act in 1998, and my father actually was the first U.S. ambassador. It is often received as cultural imperialism and Americans only looking out for Christians overseas. And what's beautiful about this language is we happen to be Christians and these are our principles, but precisely because of these principles, we are not going to be a Christian nation. We're going to allow for any faith or none to flourish and prosper. And the Jewish synagogue that takes place in Newport is actually Newport, Rhode Island, is also a key element of the religious freedom evolution, because George Washington writes them a letter in 1790, and he issues the famous line, "To bigotry, no sanction; to persecution, no assistance," just a year before the First Amendment. I mean, so this stuff is key, but it's the judgment, the capacity to have judgment and say these are principles. They do exist in other cultures, but we can't come in with our cookie-cutter approach and say, you need to look like us. So point well made. Sir.
Hi, my name is Zia, and I'm from Pakistan. I was born in Lahore.
All right.
So first of all, thanks for this talk. I really appreciate that you're trying to work on these kind of things, pluralism and bringing people from different religions together. But the question that I have is, you are trying to tie religious freedom and terrorism together, as if lack of religious freedom is resulting in terrorism, which I don't agree with. Do you think, for example, the 9/11, for example, you gave the example of 9/11 and people denying. I understand that people in Pakistan and other Muslim countries deny the fact that 9/11 was carried out by Muslims, and they try to think of it as a conspiracy and whatnot, and I don't agree with them. But isn't that itself a proof that they don't think that this is something that Muslims couldn't have done, or Islam doesn't support it? Because if they really thought that this religion is teaching that, they would have said, yes, this is what religion says, and this was a very religious thing to do. They deny it outright because they cannot believe that religion can basically teach those kind of things. And secondly, you mentioned that Pakistan being the most dangerous country in the world, but think about it, like before 2001, that was not the case, right? So do you think religious freedom decreased after that suddenly resulted in Pakistan being the dangerous country, the most dangerous country of the world, and terrorists and suicide bombings happening there resulted from that?
Yeah, great questions. President Obama is taken to quoting one of the Supreme Court justices from years past lately, saying sunlight is the best disinfectant. It's a really good line. I think what Google is doing in terms of being a global public square and what religious freedom practiced at its best does just that. I don't think you get extremism and you don't get terrorism where there's a public square where extremists can be laughed at. We don't have it in democracies. In countries where there's religious freedom, extremism cannot take root and validate violence because the majority doesn't accept it. And that's what we have to move towards. Pakistan before 2001 was as dangerous and complex as it is now, it's just that we didn't know it. That's what I think. And there's other issues involved, to include the underfunding of the tribal areas in NWFP by Islamabad for the entire existence of Pakistan. But all those things play into it all at once, and now we're at a place where we have to engage the Muslim majority world in a thoughtful fashion. I think we have to engage it according to the best of their faith, and I think that is the only way that you defeat extremism. As a working example of that, Mike Gerson, my colleague, wrote a piece in the Washington Post. He's a columnist for the Washington Post, and he wrote a piece on Afghan women and how are they combating the idea that they should not be included in society. And these are women in parliament, these are women in local shuras or councils or whatever. You know, instead of appealing to Western law and Western norms and those kinds of things, where do they go? They go back to the holy texts, to Al-Quran Kareem, the Holy Quran, and the wife of the Prophet. She was a businesswoman. She's the first Muslim. Muhammad demonstrated respect for her. Now, whether you agree or disagree with whether that is or not, I don't really care. In a conservative society where Islam is the prism through which all of life is seen, that is the only way in which you are going to defeat these cultural traditions that they claim is Islamic but are nothing more than cultural traditions. That's the only way you're going to stop acid getting thrown in the face of young Pakistani and Afghan women, is to root the answer in the holy text, as opposed to saying, oh, this is the latest NGO to come through for women empowerment. They're not going to buy into that. So I think this disinfectant thing has to come in, and it has to be done in a way that's consistent with the culture and the rule of law, respects both, and says we don't have the answers, but we want to listen to you and what you have to say about how you address grievances. And that takes a long, long time. And whether it's, you call it religious freedom, freedom of conscience, a global public square, that's what we're all sort of working towards in very different fashions. All right. And then there's a question in the back. Okay.
So I'd like to ask about how do you view a contention about land?
Could you speak up just a little bit?
How do you view contention about land issues, specifically, for example, Jerusalem, where both faiths wants the same part of land, and where religious freedom is not allowed to Jews to go and pray on Temple Mount because that's an explosive dynamite which can ignite the whole area?
It's a great question. I'm not going to give you, I have my own ideas about specific answers there, but I'm not going to get into that just yet. Let me just paint the conceptual parameters. In all of the Mideast peace talks, religious leaders have never been included, which is a very bizarre thing to me. And now we're at a point, before we had strong political leaders, whether it was Arafat or Rabin Sharon, but no religious involvement. Now we have a situation where there are no strong political leaders on any of the sides, and the religious people are not included, but what is happening is, in the absence of strong political leadership, religion is being used to validate more and more extreme positions, to the point where they feed off each other. Settlers and Hamas, however you want to define that. And as a friend of mine who just got back from Israel, Palestine on an interfaith trip with Cardinal McCarrick, a friend, the former Archbishop of Washington, D.C. for the Roman Catholic Church, the way it was explained to them is you have secular yuppies from Ramallah talking to secular yuppies from Jerusalem with secular yuppies from Washington and the quartet in the EU and Russia. And so faith gets left out of it. And now I think what we need is people of faith saying, we're not the answer, we're not a panacea, but we can work according to the best of our traditions to honor that neighbor. And oh, by the way, give you political legitimacy and maneuver space to get back and have conversations. And I think that's the new and most interesting twist in the two-state process right now. I'll talk to you afterwards about all the other specifics. But if that happens, I think then you can actually have an honest conversation about the land. There was a question. Yes, sir.
So in the spirit of listening, what would you like Google to do to help?
Very kind question. I would like to continue the conversation most of all. I am fascinated by the idea that Google has essentially created a global public square. You know, and many NGOs work on saving lives, but they don't think about the life that person's going to live. You have a global public square, but how are you going to exercise and live that freedom within that public square? Now, I'm not putting the moral burden on Google or on NGOs like World Vision and World Relief to say, you know, it's your job to determine that they have these 4 freedoms, as FDR would say, et cetera, et cetera. But it's a conversation that we need to have. How do you steward this space that you've literally created out of nothing? How do you make it possible for these kids in Bannu, in Waziristan, to participate in a global public square and challenge others to take on the stereotypes about Pashtun culture and yet learn from others? Starting with English labs and computers. They don't have those things. How do we encourage social and financial entrepreneurship among those young women? It can be done. We have the relationships, we have the trust, we have the access to do that. The global public square with foreign direct investment and religious freedom are 2 sides of the same coin, as I said initially. There's freedom of ideas and there's freedom of product, and the two go hand in hand. And a lot of people have not thought that through. What does that look like? if we take an interfaith delegation to Syria or to Pakistan, who are also businessmen and women, we're demonstrating that faith is not a threat, it can be a part of the solution. We're demonstrating that businesses are successful when they have faith and morality as a part of their culture. It serves as a bulwark against the corruption that comes with the transition to market economies. But when they're together, what does that look like? What does that new sort of culture look like? That's a traveling public square. It's a traveling advertisement for the best of American culture. It's a traveling advertisement for what that culture could be according to their own principles and values. That has not been thought through, in part because we all get real squirmy talking about religion and politics still. And it's hard to do. There are no USAID programs that are funding religion, discussions of issues of religion in the Northwest Frontier Province. That is astounding to me. Astounding. You want to know what the number one issue in Pakistan is? If you want to deal with justice, figure out the role that religion plays in local dispute mechanisms. All these people came out of SWAT, 2 million people out of this one district north of Peshawar because the Taliban took it over and they beat that woman. We all saw it on YouTube. Well, now they're going to come back and there's going to be a whole bunch of squatters, and you know what? The Taliban's going to come back in and say, we'll help you do the dispute because the government's not there. We have to have a competing vision of social justice that comes out of this idea of a public square, whether it's informational, virtual, or actual. And if we can continue to have that conversation and look at how technology enables that and works with NGOs like us who are trying to do the same thing, social justice, in a way that is consistent with the purpose of Google, I think that is a much needed conversation. I wish I could be more practical, but I think it's that nascent and that emerging.
Any more questions or comments? Okay.
I have a question. I lived for a while. I think I can do it.
Well, there are people video
I work at Menlo Park Presbyterian Church, and I have lived in Amman and Cairo and traveled in the Gaza Strip. So I'm struck greatly by your comment that the best of faith is the best way to defeat the worst of religion. I love that statement, and I fully agree with it. And in the conversations and in the ways that I have learned to have conversations and listen to others, I'm struck by what you said also at the beginning about being non-proselytizing, racist. Yeah. Because at the end of the day, the best of my faith comes back to the best of Jesus, and the best of Muslim faith comes back to what the Prophet says. So I'm having a hard time reconciling what you do after you do listen. What do you do after you do establish the conversations and the common ground? Because at some point it does come back to my faith in Jesus, or my faith in the Prophet, or my faith as a Jew. So how do you reconcile those?
No, that's a great question, and two things. One is I get all my best lines from Jesus, plagiarizing unapologetically. You know, Jesus has the toughest words in the entire Bible are for the religious establishment. And he says, you go and cross hill and dale to make a convert, proselytize, and you turn them into twice as much a son of hell as you are. That is unbelievably harsh and very un-PC. And then he says, later, this is Matthew 23, he says later in that chapter, you're good at counting, quantification of converts. But at the end of the day, that's really about us. That's us defining success as opposed to being obedient and loving our neighbor. And so he says this, you've forgotten the larger picture, faith, mercy, and justice. So when we engage Muslims, we say, look, we differ about the person of Isa, which is Arabic for Jesus. The Holy Quran says he's born of the Spirit of God, so he's greater than prophets, but he's not the Son of God. I believe he's the Son of God. Those are irreconcilable theological differences. Let's be good with that. What do we have in common? Peace, justice, mercy, compassion, love. Those are action verbs. And for true people of faith, they take those seriously and think about ways to work together. And that's where, and I get back to answer your question directly, relational diplomacy, its third characteristic is that it's defined by practical agreements with people on the ground who, no kidding, live there. And what I have found, every culture, every faith has somebody thinking exactly the same way as I am. And they want their people to be a part of a global society, a global economy, a global civilization. They want to be a global shareholder. They're angry as all get out that their part of the world is portrayed as the home of terrorism or the home of repression or the home of authoritarianism. And they want to fight that. So you find ways to work on it together. The most developed example of that is in one of these handouts on our trip to Vietnam, where we've been doing this for quite some time, and we have actually 4 agreements. And if you really want to know, I'll send you those 4 agreements. The least developed is in Syria, where we're still trying to think it through with them. And there's another trip report that talks about Syria, where we don't know where we're going. But you know what? We're okay with that, because the relationships have to be strong, and then the strategies are revealed through the relationships with government officials and grassroots leaders. It has to be both simultaneously and transparently, or you get nowhere. You will be received as a Christian, a Bible in one hand, a sword in the other, even as we receive Muslims as the Quran in one hand and a bomb in the other. We got to get past that. And that's the way to do it, I think.
Okay, so one more comment? Okay, last one.
I'm wondering what kind of experience you've had with saying, okay, you don't believe Jesus is the Son of God. We don't believe the prophet is whatever. I'm not sure how to say that properly. But he said these things, and he being both of them. And you can act on them, you can believe in them, even if you don't believe in the true power, in the power of the source. That is,
right.
Talk to the statements, not talk to the irreconcilable religious differences. Does that work?
Yeah, you're really getting to the nub, and I know we're out of time, but very briefly, I'll use the Arab or the Muslim theological context. They have a word called ijtihad. Jihad, there's the internal or the greater struggle for spiritual self-discipline, and then the external or lesser struggle against those who attack the faith. How that gets interpreted, of course, is everything. And so in ijtihad, it's a reinterpretation of the holy text. What do these words actually mean? How do we think about them? If I'm a Christian and I only read Joshua 6, where it says they dedicated the city of Jericho to destruction and killed every man, woman, and child, I don't have a whole lot of places to go with that. But I need to think through my theological construct and how that Old Testament and New Testament relate and all those kinds of things. They're doing the same thing. They've got the Mecca period, they got the Medina period. They got the period when Muhammad had no political power, and they have the period where he had power. And then how do we think about these holy texts and these teachings and then relate them to the sayings of the prophet, the hadiths, that later get recorded by people like al-Bukhari? So it varies. All politics is local. All theological interpretation is more local. And you have to get really one-on-one and talk these things through. And this takes time. And Americans don't have time. And so in the global public square of one click away and Google advertising, those kinds of things, we have to do the exact opposite and say, we're going to sit down and drink some tea with you, and we're going to have 10 days and get to know you over tea and over long nights on Peshawar rooftops. And the irony is, if you invest in the relationship up front and spend 18 months getting to know these folks, or 3 years, practical results happen because they respect you because you know who you are. And you respect them because they know who they are. But you're never going to bridge that gap, probably theologically or even politically. But the common value is about serving the other and serving your neighbor and providing governance that gives security and services to the people around you is in everybody's interest, because everybody wants stability to live a life free of violence. It just takes a while. But our donors, our American Western system, don't like that. They want to see a quarterly report with a quantifiable, measurable result. A relationship is not that. But it will precisely yield those results if you allow the time for your VC money to expand the relationships, because you've chosen the right partner and the right NGO with the right leadership who's asking the right questions.
Okay, if you have more questions, feel free to join us. We're going to Charlie's with Chris as well as his guest, Mike Gerson. So feel free to join us.
Thanks so much.